Hello and welcome to the August 17th meeting of the Finance Committee pursuant to the Governor's June 16th, 2021 Act relative to extending certain COVID-19 measures adopted during the state of emergency, suspending certain provisions of the Open Meeting Law, General Laws, Chapter 30A, Paragraph 20. The Finance Committee will be using remote participation for this meeting. The audio of this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the town's webpage within 24 hours in accordance with keeping the public informed of actions during this meeting. I would ask that all participants remotely attending this meeting please state your name for identification purposes each time you speak throughout the meeting. At this time, a roll call attendance vote will be taken. Ms. Zemer.
Here.
Mr. Whitaker.
Here.
Mr. Murphy.
Here.
And I'm here. That constitutes a quorum, so we are legally meeting. And just for those of you at home who may be watching this later, if you're tired of hearing that statement, I'll just remind you that that's a required statement we have to read before every meeting. So I know it sounds remarkably gibberish-like, but all it basically says is that we're allowed to meet remotely. So let's go right to the agenda and get started. Okay, first up is minutes, and I do want to update everybody. As you recall, when we talked earlier this year or late last fiscal year, if you're thinking in fiscal years, we discussed the position at the town clerk's office, having some hours for minutes. I'm happy to say that that has reached fruition. So we now have some minute assistants. Travis, you saw my response, Travis, yesterday, right on that. So Liz went back and looked for meetings where we didn't have minutes posted, or, and there was, long story short on that one is we now have somebody helping out, and I've told Travis to have her start going back through the ones. There are a few gaps we have in minutes that were either between clerks or minutes that we started to do with our former helper and never got through, things like that. So that's in progress. Hopefully we'll be totally caught up, and going forward, we'll have somebody to watch our meetings and produce minutes for us. So that would be a good thing, because that would be the first time in how many years, Michelle, since we had Faith doing it faithfully and Nancy doing it faithfully, that kind of thing.
2 years.
It's been more than that. I mean, Nancy's been gone, I think, for 2 years.
Yeah.
And there was about a year and a half before she left that was, where she was having difficulty getting them done. So we've been shouldering the burden for quite some time. So that's certainly good news. Hold on, let me just check this, see if it's Mr. Alfred, just to see if he's joining us. Nope, he said he's going to be on in a minute. Okay. But on the other than that, I don't have any administrative issues. As I said before, we kind of went on the air from a calendar perspective, meeting perspective, given what's happening right now with the Delta variant and the current uptick in cases, et cetera. I had said earlier, we'll reevaluate at the end of the summer where we are in terms of in-person meetings, but we will continue to meet remotely because frankly, with what's going on now, it doesn't make sense to have 7 of us in a room when the CDC is recommending that even vaccinated people wear masks indoors. So odds are we'll be doing this as long as things look the way they look now. If things calm down in the future, which they will at some point, but when they calm down, we'll reassess again. So, okay. So the major reason for tonight and why I call the meeting is all of you saw, we got the staff recommended revisions to the policy document as part of the every 2-year review. I hope everybody had a chance to read it, and I'd like to just have the discussion on our side. They're looking for feedback on it. So let's, anybody want to start, just raise your hand and we'll start the discussion on what everybody saw. Let's see, I'm trying to find which one. Okay, so Michelle, you can go, but Travis, let me just ask you a question. Which one was the one you sent us 2? One was redlined and one was...
The other one is essentially what I'd recommend is a new policy. I think it's kind of repetitive, but it's specific to the unassigned fund balance. So it's
okay. That's right.
That one,
I just want to make sure.
Red line because it's brand new.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll talk about the red line version first, and we'll go from there. Okay. Go ahead, Michelle.
Okay. So I had questions about OPEB. Do any school employees pay into Middlesex County, or do they all pay into that state pension?
Is that for me?
That's for Travis.
That's for Travis, yes. The questions are going to be for you, Travis.
Okay, so generally speaking, full-time employees of a school system are going to be an MTRS. There are a number of exceptions to that, where it's an employee of the school is not eligible for MTRS and therefore is in MCRS if they are a retirement eligible employee. So they're 20 hours plus, but they're not eligible for MTRS. Then we would enroll them in MCRS, Middlesex County Retirement System. So we do have some liability related to the schools in the Middlesex County Retirement System. But for the most part, your standard teacher and those types of employees would all be in MTRS, Mass Teachers Retirement System, which is funded annually by the state. And I have some information about how that looks. It shows up in our audit, but it doesn't show up in our budget. As a long-winded way of saying, yes, there are some school-related people in MCRS. The majority are in MTRS.
Okay. Hold on. So how does MTRS look?
Not great.
So why are we just looking at Middlesex County and not the other?
So we have no control over MTRS, right? It's run by the state. It's funded by the state, which is very helpful to us. So the liability sits on their books. The pension, the contributions sort of show up. They both get put onto our statements, but we have no control over either the liability or the contributions. It's all sort of controlled by the state. The most common occurrence you'd see in this town or any town is a teacher aide comes into the system. They're not eligible for MTRS. We put them in MCRS. They become a full-time teacher. They transfer their Middlesex County Retirement System to the Mass Teachers Retirement System, and they're off the Middlesex County Retirement System books. But essentially, when we had the conversation about setting up the pension fund, the 5D fund, which is new and obviously one of the major changes we have in the financial policies because it didn't exist 2 years ago. We highlighted that the pension liability in the town, right? We're focused on Middlesex County because we're legally obligated to fund that. It hits our budget every year. But we do have two liabilities, right? We have the Middlesex teachers, we have the Mass teachers, and we have the Middlesex County. One just more directly impacts our annual budget.
So we don't, but we contribute to the Mass teachers, right?
The state does on our behalf.
Right. We don't actually put any cash into it ourselves.
Okay, so we don't have to worry about that liability?
If everything stays the same from now on, the state will continue to contribute on our behalf for the liability of our teachers in the Mass Teachers Retirement System. To the point, right, of what is our liability or what do we think of if we have concerns over the Middlesex County Retirement System's funding ratio, which is under 50% funded, then I would have the same concern over MTRS, but it doesn't directly impact our annual budget because those contributions come from the state and are funded through the state's budget annually.
Okay, that was my only question. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Murphy.
Well, I just want some debate regarding the contribution, splitting the OPEB 1.5 million, it's the target right here, splitting up into the retirement. I think, how does that affect us with the OPEB spend down? And that's his question basically both to Ken, because he's intimate with the whole OPEB trust, and also to you, Travis. So if we move money over, how is that going to affect our goal of getting somewhat balanced or lower our liability for the?
It's going to push out the date at which we're fully funded for OPEB without question. That's stated in the document too, but that's the issue. And I'll tell you, right, that's one of my concerns as well. In the end, and I'll let Travis give his opinion in a second, but in the end, the one thing I would say is the money's all going to the same place anyway, and that odds are that the pension stabilization fund will be in crit just like the OPEB trust. So in some sense, it's just a matter of which bucket you put it in, because you can't move buckets. But it's a philosophical question from my standpoint, right? To sit there and say we're going to delay it to line it up with the pension funding and so forth. There's a part of me that says that we've been saying for many years, stick to the plan, get to the end, decide what to do with the money. So I too have reservations about saying, hey, we're going to shift some of the OPEB money over. I would much prefer to stick on the plan for OPEB, use free cash excesses to put into the pension stabilization fund for the foreseeable future, and then shift the OPEB money over when we've reached full funding. But that's just me, right? There are others here. So Travis,
I would say, for the philosophical question, when I'm looking at these two, which again, I reference it when we're discussing it as two sides of the same coin, right? These are all benefits going to retirees. We're planning for that liability. We're actuarially calculating them. You can actuarially calculate a pension much more accurately liability than OPEB because you don't know the cost of healthcare in 30 years and you don't know what's going to happen on the national level that could impact that. Whereas we can make assumptions, we can make less conservative assumptions, but we can pretty much calculate the benefits that are going to be lined up through the pension system that are only going to get potentially worse for employee if the state makes more changes like they have in the past couple decades. Whereas, again, it is very difficult to identify what the cost of healthcare is in 30 years, right? A single payer healthcare system could throw the entire thing on its head. So philosophically, if we were going to say, focus on one of these two liabilities, I would say pension is the one to focus on. Now, obviously complicating that issue is the Middlesex County Retirement System, which we are a part of, and we are going to be legally obligated to continue to fund on a schedule that's determined every 2 years. We are not legally obligated to fund our OPEB, although the town has decided that it's best practice and puts us in a very good position. And we have now decided that rather than super funding the Middlesex County Retirement System because of some up and down returns, which I have and can put up on the screen if anybody has questions, that we would prefer to do it ourselves because the PRIT system has proven to do a very good job on the OPEB trust, right? All of that makes sense. My point is, philosophically, if we're going to say attack one rather than the other, I would focus on pension.
Except that, and I'll get to you, Dan, sorry, but the comment I'd make on that is, if we were starting from scratch, that's the debate we'd have, but we're not starting from scratch, right? We put a plan in place. I've never liked the idea of you sell something to the town and you say, this is what we're going to do and this is the objective we're going to achieve. And then you get halfway through it and you say, okay, now we're going to move the goalposts or change the game, right? Even unless there's a compelling reason, right? If there were, again, in this case, it's not like you're saying, okay, we put it in pension and suddenly we double our return. So there's a compelling financial reason. It's the same place, right? So part of me says, I like to see things through and get to where we said to the town we were going to get before we start robbing the till, especially when we've been saying for many years, stay the course when other forces have sought to take that money. Now, I understand in this case, we're not taking the money and spending it, right? So it's not the same type of decision. But to me, I think it's a good thing to go back to the town in 2033 or whatever and say, we started this plan, 20 something years ago, and we got to where we're going to go. And now let's tackle the next thing, which we've been building on. But Vin, do you have anything more before I go to Dan?
No, just want to add, I tend to agree with you in the sense we have a plan and we should kind of stick to it. But at the same time, I agree with Travis saying it's something we need to think about is the retirement. So I don't think robbing one to pay for the other is necessarily what we should be doing. I think something like, hey, we need to get both of these down. It's too much of a nut out there. Let's have a plan in place. And I'm concerned if we say, oh, we're just going to use X amount in free cash, that free cash is to be zapped up and we need to have something disciplined and said, okay, we have X amount of dollars. And I don't know what X amount of dollars is. I think we need to figure that out.
So I can show you what this looks like on paper based on the 2037 schedule, if you'd like to see what the recommendation looks like.
Sure, go ahead.
I do need somebody to enable me as a...
Oh, you're not, okay, hold on, let me, where are you? There you are.
All right, so this is just high level. So the OPEB trust here up until, the blue is what we've already budgeted. So the 1.5s are in there. This is the balance. It hasn't been audited yet, but that's the market value, 21.85 million. The OPEB trust at the end of June of FY21. So this is assuming a change to 1.25 million starting in FY23, which is the policy essentially says we'll look at in 23. And then that would extend the schedule to 2037 rather than 2033, which is mentioned down here. This is the new fund right here. As you can see, we've just begun taking the MCRS surplus rather than reinvesting it in Middlesex, which we've done in the past few years. We've now put it as the seed money into this new 5D fund that was established in May. We did that at the end of 21. We'll do that for 22. And then this would be assuming in FY23 based on the recommendation. That's what this is showing, $250,000 plus that continued process on an annual basis, assuming 6% return, which is what we have on some. We can obviously adjust those down however we want to look at it, and looking at what that would do over time, and lining it up with what the schedule that MCRS has, including the capped increases. So these are assumed rates of return in these two columns. This is not an assumed rate of return. I just want to make sure people understand that. The actuarial funding schedule for MCRS is 2037, and that's sort of the idea behind lining these two up. When we're looking at the budgetary impact, which Vin mentioned a second ago, which is what can we actually, sort of do outside of just assuming free cash. This is a tax levy impact, right? This is how much we're doing, whether it's the OPEB contribution, the MCRS contribution, and now considering a pension stabilization contribution of how much we can actually afford to increase this per year as we go forward. And these are, I think, right in part of the recommendation from staff is to think of, what can we actually build in here that isn't going to, sort of upset the apple cart? What can we afford to do while also making significant headway and staying on schedule overall by lining these two up? So that's the thought process. I just wanted to show that, and I can pull it back up if you want, but I understand there's other people ready to talk.
Well, can I just follow up with something? I'm looking at the actual aerial valuation results, and they're using increase ADC over prior year, 6.5% for the next, 8 years, and then slowly drop. Now, I don't know how accurate those numbers are. They're, like you said, and you got a very valid point, who knows what the medical retirements, I'm sorry, these are all retirements, so forget OPEB. So we're using a lot lower increases. And you're showing 5%, 4 and 5. So this is 1.5.
I'm showing for the net. So I'm assuming for MCRS, we'd have 7% annual increases to our contribution. So legally, PERAC can force MCRS to drop its funding schedule, which increases the liability or increases the annual contributions. But PERAC also says that legally you can cap what you're allowed. You will allow your annual contribution to go up by. So it doesn't actually work, but it's to protect towns budgetarily, right? To avoid overrides. So, I think you can go up to 8% essentially. They have been keeping it under 7. I would say that, it's probably going to have to go into 7 to stick to a 2037 schedule. And so that's what I'm assuming here.
Okay.
Then they also continue to drop their assumed rate of return, right, as is a best practice now. But if you just drop it from what used to be 8%, everybody assumed, and then they made it on their bond returns. Now, you're dropping it slowly over time to match the fact that the market rates are averaging out less than that 8%. So now they're in the low 7s. They're going to try to make their way down to 6.5 over time.
Well, I do remember reading in the ratings, they suggest S&P like 6%. So I don't know if that's something we need to think about too.
Right. And that's why we start with that on the OPEB side, right? And we'll start with that on the pension stabilization side. The 8% that they're working their way down from is not just Middlesex. It's all of these systems in Massachusetts that are now kind of coming back down to earth and doing it. They're just trying to do it slowly over time.
Okay, I'm done for now.
Okay. And by the way, just for the record, Vin, when we did OPEB, we've always assumed 6%. The only reason we've ever used anything different is because GASB required, like our last valuation required 7%. They had some rate that was fixed by GASB when you're funding it or something like that. So our last evaluation used 7%, but we've internally always used 6%.
Well, but we now have that the discount rate is going to be 7% in the policies, and I would assume that's for the liability, right? Can you not hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
you. Okay, so we're doing a 7% discount rate on the liability, whereas I thought it had been 6%, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That's in
the updated policy. So we've already sort of lowered our liability and closed our liability gap, haven't we, through the last GASB?
But I'm looking at it, it's based on the assumptions by the actuary. So it's just a fact. So we can say whatever we want and say we suggest we use X, Y, Z, but that's just a statement of fact, I'm guessing. Correct, okay. Travis, when you wrote this? July 1, 2019, the valuation date is X, and you have all these different things, and discount rate is 7% versus 6%.
Right, and that was the GASB thing I was talking about.
Yeah,
right.
This is the 7% is what Odyssey has in the last one, and it's all just sort of keeping up with GASB, yes, too.
Okay, we're still using 6% for when we think will actually be done.
In the chart you just showed, yes.
Yeah, okay. So just getting back to the issue Vin brought up, I mean, I'm basically in agreement with them. You know, for 10 years, we've been telling the town 1.5, that's where we need to be. You know, as we get closer, we can reassess, but we're not, you know, there yet. And I think it sends a message that could be confusing to some, you know, when we said, you know, we're not going to touch OPEB, we're not going to touch OPEB. That said, I think that we also do need to put in place a plan to be funding the retirement system, because we haven't been in it. And, you know, I think that one potential option would be to add in a financial policy that says that the first X dollars of free cash go towards the retirement. And if it's a quarter of a million, then actually it's going to be fairly easy to do, right? You could probably maybe even do more if you wanted to. And then after that, we would consider whether we do more or less, but then you keep the 1.5 and you still get your $250,000, unless something weird happened and we hit a free cash number that we've never hit before.
Right. And just to be clear on that, right? To me, and this is something for us to discuss, when you talk about free cash, first you should be top up stabilization. What I mean by top up is we maintained a certain percentage of the omnibus. So you're going to have to add a little bit, small amount every year to keep it right. So top up stabilization. Then if what we've done in the past is done that, and then the rest goes to capital. And that's been a substantial amount, as Travis has pointed out, right? Now, obviously not all free cash years are good years, and we've had several good years recently, but even if you go back to go back to before we even had it out of the budget, it was budgeted at $500,000 in free cash into the operating budget every year before we took it out. So, and that was because it was pretty reliably $500,000 or more every year, right?
And the lowest, I think, in my time, it's been 690. I think was the lowest.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is, so if the desire is to put 250, and you're going to need maybe, let's say, $100,000 to put in stabilization to keep it topped up, right? You can have a policy that says, okay, top up stabilization to a certain level if it's not there, right? Because the other thing is you can still do the excess and build it up further. Then put 250 into stabilization, into a pension stabilization fund. Then with the rest, you can look at either, capital or stabilization or pension, depending on the needs.
Can we just say at a minimum 250?
Yeah,
and then
so that's what I'm saying. Is you can just say at a minimum, 250 for that, and and then I think that's has a number of positive ramifications, not the least of which is that it's not ambiguous in how we're going to treat free cash in terms of one-time expenses, right? So it goes to the one-time funds. And if we had a $3 million year and we put $1 million into capital and, 400,000 into stabilization, we could do $1.5 million into pension that way, right? If we thought that was that in a sense is the good part about it is, I think you can very reliably, based on our track record, say we're going to get at least 250 to put in there and maybe more until such a time as, OPEB trails off, and then you can look at shifting the entire burden over there. So, but that would be my preference, but that's just me, right? I'm just one of the members.
I'm fine with that.
So,
anyone else on this, or I have some other things as we go through the document?
So, well, okay, so we'll, you know, we'll let Travis stew on that one for a while. And then, okay, so if you have other things, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, so just on page 2, the reserve fund, you suggest going from 200 minimum to 250. And, you know, since we're at 325, I wonder if we don't almost consider even taking it to 300 or something like that. I know we want to give ourselves a little wiggle room, but things have grown significantly. This is what, a 0.5% of the omnibus or less. They've been at 300. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah, so on the reserve fund?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
that,
then,
I mean, you know, at some level, I was wondering why, if you're going to change it from 200, change it to 300, because it's been 315 for, aside from the pandemic, it's been 315 for a very long time. And you know, the plan is to keep it where it is at 315, right? So why not make it 300,000?
325, but yeah.
You know what I mean? That area.
I think if I go into 325 too, but if we're going to change it, at least get it closer to where we are rather than sort of a significant, a gap.
Yeah.
So that would be my recommendation there. Going forward, so one thing you changed the stabilization fund to just the general stabilization fund name. I'm fine with that. I would make sure that you're consistent throughout the rest of the document, though. If you're going to define a term, then you need to use that term, the full term, throughout the rest of the document. There are just areas where, just on page 2 at the bottom, there's the, Standard & Poor's based on the stabilization fund alone, and then on page 3 where it says progress, it says the stabilization fund. It's just a formatting thing. But
can I interrupt for a second, Dan?
Yep.
Yeah, the one thing I would ask about that, Travis, is that was one thing I was curious about. You change it to general stabilization fund. I expected that change was going to mean that you were going to define, I looked at it differently than you did. And at first I was confused because I thought when you said general stabilization fund, you were separating that from what is now going to be the pension stabilization fund, right? So I thought I'd see that, you made that definition change, said, okay, this is a general stabilization fund. And I thought you'd have a second definition that says, pension stabilization fund, which is a general stabilization fund dedicated for the use of pension, whatever. But it looks like you use the term to mean the combination of the two, like any fund that falls under Chapter 5, right? That's what's, I think Dan is confusing to Dan as well. So do we want to add a section, a definition of a pension stabilization fund, and say it's established under blah, and add a section specifically on that in there?
We can certainly add definitions. The purpose for the term general stabilization fund, and just so people are aware, I mean, most towns have more stabilization funds than we have, which is fine. But what the biggest thing from my perspective on the word general is that it is one of the major functions that allows our stabilization fund to be considered, if you look at the last 10 years of our actuarial studies, to be part of our unassigned fund balance. And from an S&P standpoint, when they're looking at stabilization funds and they're dealing with Massachusetts towns, a stabilization fund means a lot of different things in a lot of different towns, depending on the circumstance. But a general stabilization fund is clearly defined, and clearly an auditor is going to look at and put it in your unassigned fund balance. And then when you look at our unassigned fund balance, and that's the separate policy that I sent, which is what really allows S&P to benchmark us with towns outside of Massachusetts, it is clearly the most stabilizing factor of our unassigned fund balance. And it's what I think we need to focus on making sure, because one of the staff recommendations near, which I know, just as, your focus generally as a finance committee is in favorability of higher reserves. Others are saying the reserves may be high enough. Why don't we scale back? My point is the general stabilization fund balance is very important because it is what is going to drive our unassigned fund balance and keep us as a AAA community. And that is really the intention of making sure that the word is consistent. To Dan's point, I will make sure it's consistent throughout the document. But that's it. And it's not to separate it from the pension stabilization fund. It's to separate it if the town wants to create other stabilization funds of any kind. That leads me to one other point. I did get into discussion last night. Michelle and Vin were on the call as it relates to, and this might be something that you want to consider as you think of your own recommendations for changes to our recommendations, is one potential ability to set a plan in place is to how we want to approach cannabis revenue. So the town, when we first started collecting cannabis revenue, there was not a local option that is now an option for the town. You can have a town meeting vote to say that X percent, it has to be above 25, goes to a stabilization, the rest goes to the general fund or whatever. And right now there's nothing. So the money is flowing to free cash. Now we have put more from free cash into the general stabilization fund. So I would make the case, if anybody at some point has an issue with the way the town has handled cannabis revenue, that every dollar that was collected is now in general stabilization. I can prove that out on paper. But the other point is, moving ahead, if you're looking at now a new bucket, which is the pension stabilization fund, the general stabilization fund, which, as staff is making the recommendation, is very, very important. You're looking at a CapEx fund, that it might be advantageous in this October meeting, looking ahead to FY23, to say, here's how the town is going to handle cannabis revenue. We had 5-year HCAs that are coming to an end, and now everything is going to be fluctuating based on 3% of wholesale sales. There is no cannabis company in the town that can operate without an HCA, so everybody will have an agreement to pay us some sort of revenue. It is going to look different than the first iteration that we saw. So if we ever wanted to build it into our local receipts, we are now in a position where it can fluctuate much more than it could from the first iteration of HCAs. So it may make sense to say, we're going to put every dollar of cannabis revenue into the general stabilization fund, for example. Now you have a funding schedule. Now you've taken that off of the other things that you're considering every year with free cash. It might make sense to say, we don't know how much this is doing. We don't know the impact of the community. We want to be prepared if the community feels like it needs to respond to any impacts of cannabis. And so we're going to create a stabilization fund separate from the general stabilization fund and put every dollar into that for a later appropriation from town meeting for a specific purpose. And that's the other thing that I sort of very made clearly in the email to the finance committee and the select board, that these are recommendations based on updating the policies from 2 years ago, but it does not have a recommendation at the moment. I think we need to have more discussion on where cannabis revenue plays in this whole conversation, because it could impact any of the things we just discussed.
One thing I think I asked for was that we have a point put on at some point an agenda item to go over the projections for cannabis revenue, at least through the 5 years, and then any kind of, if you're doing any sort of projection other than that, just to sort of see what or see where the unknowns are and what the potential is, or even what the HCA partners are telling us they think that the revenues are going to be, to get a sort of a gauge of where the high level mark is going to be, and then we can cut it in half.
Was that a pun? High level mark? No.
And no pun intended.
Well, maybe we can put it all in one pot.
Right. Oh, now you're
now you're
yes.
So anyway, I think that's a worthwhile conversation. But just going on in the capital outlay section of page 3, you strike the minimum target annual capital outlay of 2%.
Yes, that was on my list too. Yeah.
But you do sort of bring it back, I guess, on page 4. I guess, is that what you're sort of striking it and putting it on page 4? And then, I think that maybe 2% actually maybe it's something we want to talk about, whether we want to increase that to 3 or 4%, because I think that one thing that we're realizing is as we see all these fund studies come back, is that there is going to be, whether some of it is through grants or not, there's going to be significant increased ask for certain things within town, and that there is no such thing. And I don't think that we're gonna ever feel like we don't have enough money being put aside for capital, even as we maybe try to spend down the capital somewhat.
Just to clarify where the document sits. So you're talking about here on. This is page 4 right here in the middle is where it got replaced. And the purpose of this, and again, I went through this with Sharon and Mary, and I think there's multiple ways to word it. And, certainly I'm more of a math person than an English major. And certainly it could be tweaked. The purpose of this explanation and the 2% of why it's rewritten here is to say that whether we're having a conversation like we had last year where I was at 1.6 and you were at 2 and we ended up at 1.75, or whatever the number is that people are comfortable with, I think they're both justifiable when we look at the capital planning that you just referenced. We can continue to look at that for 5 years, 10 years. And you're right. I mean, either number, quite honestly, is justifiable. My point in writing this the way it is that in a given year, if the town is interested in building debt back in and not excluding it, so debt service that we want to incur debt, but we do not want to allow it to be over the levy limit. It's going to protect the taxpayer. We have zero debt within our budget. And so to build that back in, the only ability we have to do that right now is the money that we're taking from the tax levy and putting into the capital expenditure fund, right? That's the 1.6 million, 2 million, $1.75 million conversation we had last year. So the purpose of writing it the way that I've written it here is so that everybody is aware, S&P as well, that if we're going along and on an annual basis, we're putting in 1.75 million, $2 million, whatever the number that we can continue to discuss, is that at some point to build in debt service into the budget, that number needs to probably go down drastically. And we're not quitting on our plan. We are accomplishing capital in a borrowing way rather than a cash capital way. That's the purpose of this. So if you don't think it's well written, I'm happy to.
I think
I'm not quibbling. I'm not quibbling with what you're doing. I'm simply saying that given what you just said, that we should probably raise it to a minimum of 3% with a target of 5%. And what I'm saying is we exactly because of what you've written, which I agree with, we need to raise those numbers. So as I said, I would propose doing a minimum of 3% for now because we're already at what did you say? We're already at 2.8 with a goal, and we can a 3-year goal, a 5-year goal, something like that, of getting it to 5%. And it may be that within that period we actually do use some for debt exclusion or whatever. But I mean that a goal of getting that to 5%. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah,
Which is that?
and I would agree with that. I'm all for the debt plus capital set being the measure, right? The within the levy debt plus the capital money to the capital expenditure fund. But I definitely flag the 2% because that's well below what we're putting in, as you note there. And if we're looking at the capacity to do some debt funding within it, then the number needs to be higher.
How much is, from a dollar standpoint, is 3% versus 5%?
It's well, on our 1.75, I did the calculation, it would be 1.8 something. It would have, for last year, it would have resulted in a number of 1.875.
What about 5%? Come on, Mr. Math.
That'd be almost double, right? So it'd be 3 1/4.
Okay.
Something like that. I didn't do the math, but it'd be,
Yep, no, makes sense.
Yeah. But that's always, to be honest with you, that's always been my point when we've had this discussion, right? Is not that it has to be this much goes into the capital expenditure fund. I'm okay with the debt part of saying you fund some debt within that amount, but the total amount needs to be higher. We already know.
675 for sidewalk upkeep.
Yeah. Well, we're not going to have that discussion tonight, but yes, that's just another indicator that we need to have more capacity.
So just moving on so I can get through mine and then we can either talk, discuss more. Under the progress, Travis, you said we 1.75 in fiscal year 20. I think we mean 2022.
No, I had that in 20 as well. I double checked that. It seemed to be the number that we had on.
Because we did it in 20. It's the same page. We did it in 20 as well. That's right, because we just kept it flat from 20. But it's also the one we did in 2022. So if we're updating this, we may just want to say 20. But also,
so I just kept FY20 consistent because they're all the numbers that were audited, so that they're all coming from the same place.
Okay, but then you also have in fiscal year 20 at the end of that sort of section, and I think that's duplicative.
Yeah.
Okay, moving along. Debt service, water. One thing, and granted we don't have is that a couple of years ago, the select board voted to decrease the water rates while everybody is worried about water, having enough money for water infrastructure and all the other things. And so I would recommend adding that we do not reduce, that we put in the place of fiscal policy that we do not reduce water rates, at least until the water infrastructure fund has been eliminated. I'm not opposed to reducing water rates, but if we still think that we need the water infrastructure fee, then we probably should not be reducing water rates.
Yeah, I think, one of the things the select board has to bring back is sort of, is there a way? So, I mean, this is always a controversy in any town on water rates, right? Any of the flat fees that you do are going to get paid by every single person, right? So even if you're, generally speaking, people are concerned about a small elderly couple that is, not using a lot of water and still has a bill because they have all of these standard fees. The problem is, as people have more low flow, low flush toilets and all these different things, that you need to continue to fund the entire system. And so anyway, the point is, if you want to discuss removing those, the reality is to continue the capital plan that we have, you're just building it into the rate. And so to your point, I get it. I mean, no matter what, however we're talking about, if it's removing a flat fee, if it's building everything to the rate, all of those things need to be considered.
I just don't want rates being cut while we're still doing the fee. Whether we increase them or not, that's it's not something we really have purview over. I mean, we do obviously through the budget, but it was a small decrease, but it just sort of struck me as odd that we would be decreasing water rates as we're charging a fee. So I just think it might be best to put in a financial policy that says, unless we're eliminating the fee, the water rates are not going down. If anything,
yeah, I mean, I would note there too. I was surprised, obviously being relatively new to town, how, in the grand scheme of things, how new that water fee is, that infrastructure fee. Right? I mean, it's been around 6 years, and I would argue, right, no sort of horse in the race, that it seems to be doing what was intended. So to the point that we had earlier on, sticking to a plan over time, to me, it's doing what it was intended to do, which was build up an amount to allow for consistent projects. So it built up to the water main project on Winter Street that was most recently authorized at $2.8 million, because we're talking about roughly about $1.4 million per mile of water mains. And the idea is to do, at a minimum, a mile per year, excuse me. And so, when you look at those balances, first of all, the meters are done every 10 years or so, right? Because it's technology replacement. And so you do want to build that up slowly over time. The same thing on the other one, except that we're spending because we want to do a mile a year. And then the water retained earnings, and the reason I put that in here and I separated them in the policy, which is, I think we can discuss, is to say that all of those have very different purposes, right? It's the same sort of idea on the general fund side of the general stabilization versus other stabilizations. The infrastructure fee is helping us keep up with those water main replacements. The water retained earnings from an enterprise fund perspective is really the only protection that a ratepayer has, that if something hits the fan on the water side that we need to do a project, the only thing that helps us stabilize that rate is having that protection. Plus, it allows you to do projects that are not water mains as you need. And so I put in there, a goal that was not there previously. So I'd be interested to see what you all think of that as well.
But my point is that in the 6 years since we've done the fee, the price of a mile has gone up. And we're reducing the rate, which that rate could have been held the same or maybe even increased a little bit, with that excess going to sort of go to the water infrastructure fund, maybe not directly, I don't know the accounting of it all, but essentially being thought of as being segregated to offset the increases in the price of a mile of pipe, so that you don't actually need to increase the water infrastructure fee to get back to your mile a year of funding. So all I'm saying is, can we stop cutting the rates until we actually are at a point where the water system is where it needs to be? That's all. And so I was just recommending that we add a sentence in the policy that says we're not going to cut rates until we cut the infrastructure fee, which in my mind was a sort of a signal that we were at a point where the water system was at a better point. I don't think we're ever going to cut the fee, or certainly not for for years to come in, I guess, unless we did an override for it. But
yeah. So I think where we are right now, and this was part of the Stantec study, not the one that's currently due for the water monetization, but the one for the rates. And I know I'd sent it to Vin at some point because we had a conversation on it. It's available if anybody needs it. I mean, there is a rate projection there going out, right? Assuming, that after that decrease, here's the rate, here's what it's going to, and based on the well number 5 coming online, I have anticipated probably using a couple $100,000 of water retained earnings over a 3-year span to flatten that, be able to pay for it, fold in that debt before it begins to naturally decline. I say naturally decline as if it's a natural resource, but and so, that's all built in there right now. So we are going off of what is most recently sort of given to the town or procured by the town in a water rate analysis. So I think
understand that the select board reduced rates a couple of years ago. I just don't want that to be an option. Sort of like that to be taken off the table almost.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing on this that I think is a good, not directly related to the policy per se, but something related to the water rates. When we were looking at the ARPA stuff, the proposed projects in Ollie's list of infrastructure, right? One of the things that stood out to me was number 1 on his list was replacing green sand filters at the treatment plants, right? And my first thought was that should be built into the rates, right? We know these filters are going to need to be replaced. They have an estimated useful life. So why is it that, we shouldn't be sitting here saying, okay, now we got to spend a few $100,000 to replace filters. That should have been collected as part of the water rates so that we know, because again, that's not a surprise cost. You put these filters in, they're going to eventually need to be replaced. So to Dan's point, right, I don't know what the rate study showed, but it did bother me a little bit when I saw that to say, didn't we just have a study that should have factored this in and said, this is your rate should cover the operating costs, right? That just because it's not an annual operating cost doesn't mean it shouldn't be factored into the rates. So anyway, side note, but that factors into the rates shouldn't necessarily go down thing. But
so those are all my points. So
okay, so you're good, Dan? Okay.
Yep.
Ben, you've been very patient. Go ahead.
I just want to concur with Dan. I don't say it often, but I'm going to. Yeah, I agree. The rates shouldn't go down. They should increase because right now, as you pointed out, Travis, the miles are costing us 1.5, not 1 million. So we're not even covering ourselves with just the fee. We don't want to increase the fee. That's already bad enough. But, and I don't know what the thought was. And I've had in discussion through text with Mr. Cronin about it, but it fell to naught. But I don't think it should go down. And I think they need to increase because it's not going to cover the costs, and it's got to be some sort of thing. We don't want to come back to the taxpayers and say, hey, look, we're going to increase your water rates. Hey, it's crazy. You're going to have to do an override to cover all these costs.
I think we're now to the point earlier, right? 6 years in, I think we're at a point now where we can definitively start to make assumptions or can draw conclusions on how the infrastructure fee is working, right? So I certainly bring back them. And my approach to water rates from my time at the MWRA and other communities is you want sustainable and predictable rates. If you increase it slowly over time, you avoid the roller coaster. There's a lot of towns that will just hold it at 0 until they need a 10%. And it's always difficult. I get why it happens, but that is my approach. But the water infrastructure fee, again, I mean, I was surprised personally in looking back as I was approaching this, that it's only been around for that period of time. So I think we're in position now to begin to plan it out. I to both of your points, I think that's reasonable to do.
So, yeah, and the other thing I'll point out, and I think this is often lost in the discussion, while everybody, the one specific thing that in my mind makes water different is the pipes we're putting in the ground have a lifetime of more than 100 years, right? So ductile iron has a rated life of something like 115 years. So while that doesn't mean you take 115 years to replace them, it does mean that whether you take 50, 60, or 70 years to do that, you're still going to end up with 30 years worth of preparing for the next round, right? So while I understand the urgency of saying, hey, we want to fix the water, right? The DPW superintendent, who's a water guy, right, has made it perfectly clear that the brown water is not the pipes, it's the treatment plant, it's the untreated well water, right? So that's why we have the treatment plant going in at well 5. So when you talk about pipes, there's this common misperception that's been repeated by many people, including town officials, that replacing the pipe takes care of the brown water when it doesn't, right? So in that sense, the urgency to replace the pipes is merely because they're getting old, right? So, but to my point, as we're fixing them, they're going to have a rated lifetime that's going to far exceed the time it's going to take us to replace every pipe. And that, so while we want to keep on the, mile a year, whatever we're doing, it really, in a sense, doesn't matter if it takes 35 or 45 years, because you'll still end up replacing all the pipes with plenty of time to deal with collecting future revenue to fund when they start failing 100 years from now, right? That's one of the few capital items that has such a long rated life that you have that flexibility, right? So there is, to me, while it would be nice to do, 5 miles a year, at the cost it would take to do that, right? I think you have to be very careful, because as you've heard me say many times, we're paying for the failures of the generation before us to properly plan, and we're paying for our current costs, and we're trying to put in place structures to collect for future costs. So it's a big whammy on the people of today to say to them, pay even more to decrease the future costs, when you're already shouldering the burden from people that had cheap water for 40 years and then dump the entire cost on you, right? So that's the only thing where I have a little bit of contention about, hey, let's do 5 miles a year or 3 miles a year, whatever. We don't have to do that to get the water not to be brown. And we're just putting even more of a burden on the people of today who are already shouldering a burden. I mean, look at OPEB, right? Same thing, right? Why is OPEB being paid out of our current taxes? Because for years that we were paying pensions and benefits, they weren't putting away like they should have, right? So I do think I'm very sensitive to the fact that while we want to get to a certain point, we can't just say we have to get there off the backs of just the people of today. It's okay in some cases to spread that out over enough time that it takes a longer time. And as I said, this being one of them, because you have an asset that has a 100-year lifetime. So just something to keep in mind, when thinking about these things like the rates. Doesn't really apply to the policy document though. So, okay. So did anybody have any other comments, or I'll go through a couple of things that I had, nothing as extensive as Dan, but I would point out, I too agree with Dan on the capital expenditure fund, or I shouldn't say that, the total set aside. I think it should be at least 3% and a target of 5%. With the 2% minimum there, in theory, that would say we could have put away $1.25 million last year for a combination of debt plus capital, and that is by any measure woefully insufficient. So I don't know why we put in place a policy. It says a minimum of a number we know is insufficient. So I'd be for 3 to 5 on that. With the stabilization fund in your clarification, Travis, I would recommend that a separate section is created for, you do have the retirement section, which I guess covers that. But I would add the definition to your point. You're saying I call it general stabilization because that's what S&P wants to call it, and it's to distinguish it from towns that have 20 stabilization funds. So I'm fine with that. I understand why we do that. Call that fund the general stabilization fund. But then I think we should define in here the pension stabilization fund. Now, let me ask you a question. Does S&P consider that balance? That's not unassigned, so they would not consider that as unassigned fund balance funds, right?
No.
So yeah, so I would say we define that also, define pension stabilization fund and say it's established under whatever 5D or 5B, whatever we established it under, for the purpose of that. And then just fold that into which you kind of have, right? You have that mentioned in the plan. Town will apply the difference from that to the new pension fund established under 5F, right? Or 5D rather. So I would just put that as a definition up front and say pension stabilization fund, say the fund that this town established in 2021 for the purposes of, this under chapter 5D. And then you can just reference it in the document and say the 1.5 million goes into the pension stabilization fund or something like that. That's a semantic thing. It doesn't really change the policies all that much. But I too would you heard what I said earlier about OPEB. I would greatly prefer that we look at alternate ways of doing it other than taking it from the 1.5 and say, let's build into it a free cash set aside or something like that. If it's $250,000, I think there are other ways to get it. And if we do that, I think that would have I really like to stick to the plan we sold the town, just because that was what we told them we were going to do. And all too often, as you know, government doesn't stick to what they say they're going to do. And that's what breeds everybody to think that, you can never do anything long-term in government. So I, for one, would like to prove that we can put a plan in place and stick to it. So even if I'm not around in 2033, somebody can say, they said 20 years ago we'd be here, and we're here. So.
Yeah, I guess I don't agree with the general stance on OPEB here for a number of reasons. One, every 2 years we are looking at OPEB. We're doing an actuarial study by GASB. We have to, regardless of if the town had chosen not to put $1 in, it would still need to. And so those numbers are going to change. And right, so is the 6%, 7% discount rate assumption on OPEB? No, the town has well exceeded that. And the OPEB Trust Committee is going to have to look every other year at new actuarial studies and make decisions. And, the town can choose to superfund OPEB as the town could choose to superfund pension. But if the actuarial study goes down and says that, $1.5 million is no longer needed based on the original plan, then of course you need to adapt. So that's why I don't necessarily agree with that logic.
Well, the actuarial study has never gone down. It's actually gone up for the most part.
For the liability.
So if things were ever to go down like that, sure, we could reassess. But we've been trying to keep that 2033 funding date.
But why?
What?
Why 2033?
Because that's where we started.
That's what we told the town.
That's where we started.
Yeah.
And keep in mind
why did you start there?
Well, because when we started there, that was about, what was that? That was
it was a 20-year funding schedule.
20-year funding schedule. So, and then that was also to the 1.5, which is what we had received in the savings from the health insurance, from the health insurance plan. So it was neutral to the overall operating budget for departments. And over the years, there have been a number of people, especially from one particular group, who have tried to suggest that we cut the OPEB funding schedule, or the OPEB funding.
Oh, you say that right. Have suggested that we shift the money to the operating budget.
Suggested we shift the money to the operating budget. And while this is, I understand, not what you're suggesting, and I fully understand that, I think that it could confuse, as I said at the beginning, I think it could confuse some people and the overall message that we've been sending to move it at all. And again, I'm up for continuing to look at this. I don't pretend like we're going to be putting aside $1.5 million until 2033, because if you do that, you end up with a kind of a weird thing where you are able to actually start taking money out of the account and then save $1.5 million. And it creates almost too much money sort of at the end. But I would like to get to be, in my mind, closer to sort of 5 years from fully funded. Before we start sort of cutting back on that funding, to kind of glide into the still kind of maintain that status would kind of glide more into it.
Well, the other thing I want to clarify, right, is the $1.5 million, just to be clear, right? The 2033 is the goal for when we want to get to fully funded, right? So I'm not saying that it has to be $1.5 million until 2033 either. But the evaluation that takes place every 2 years should be relative to a 2033 finish. So if they look at the actuarial report every 2 years and say, look, part of the problem with the report is, by GASB standards, you have to look at a 30-year funding schedule, which is the dumbest thing on the planet, because it's like saying, okay, every year I evaluate my mortgage, and after I paid 5 years of my mortgage, I go look and, well, look, I could pay less if I extended 30 years more, right? The goal is to say, how many years do you have remaining on the plan? 2033 is the target. So, in 2023, when they're looking at it, they should be looking at, okay, based on the current actuarial analysis, what must you be putting away for the next 10 years to get to 2033 at fully funded? And then if they said that report came back and said, okay, you can go to 1.4 or 1.3, that's different than saying, okay, if you started in 2023 and you then reach full funding 30 years from today, well, guess what? You only have to put away, $200,000 a year because you've already got all this money in the bank. That's just refinancing your mortgage forever and never actually paying it off. So to me, that's the discussion that the OPEB Trust Committee should have, is say, okay, with a 2033 end date, and the actual report we get every round, what does the contribution have to be to get to that end date? And if it's 1.6 million because we had bad returns, and we should talk about it. If it's 1.4 million or 1.3 million because we've had good returns, that's when you start having a discussion of, okay, maybe we can look at changing the amount. Just to be clear, right? So it's not that I'm married to the 1.5, never changing. I'm married to the let's get it done by 2033 part. So Michelle, go ahead.
I remember something, maybe I'm remembering correctly, about there being like a blip because all of a sudden the mortality changed and people were living longer. So something changed in the calculations. Am I
Yes, the
remembering?
actuarial life expectancy tables. Yeah.
The biggest assumptions that we change in actuarial on either side, pension or OPEB, we change mortality tables, we change assume rate of return, and we change the funding schedule. Those are the things that, right, the funding schedule is going to impact your annual contribution. As you saw in the policy, it's now the ADC on the OPEB side. On the pension side, it's still the ARC. And so, but then if you change the assumed rate of return over the life, or if you change the mortality rate, what you're doing is impacting the actual liability, which is then going to impact your funding schedule of how to get there. And so, that is one of the major ones. And that is less frequently. I mean, I would say probably every other new actuarial study, those are going to change. And they are looking at actual mortality rates and adjusting that, and then making recommendations generally through GASB of what schedule you should be adopting. And if you have the less conservative one, then S&P points it out to you every time that, oh, by the way, your pension system or your OPEB trust actuarial study is assuming the wrong mortality rate, and they use it against you.
Yeah.
I just don't feel comfortable doing something with that. I mean, we have a whole OPEB trust committee, or I don't feel comfortable making decisions without their input.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess that's where I'm, last year, and I'm the chair of the OPEB Trust Committee, and it was my first year in town, and I gathered the information that $1.5 million was a number that meant a lot to a lot of people, and had a history behind it, and, has a schedule that gets us to 2033. At the same point, I'm not sure, quite honestly, that the OPEB Trust Committee is going to come to the assumption that they want to stick to a schedule of $1.5 million for FY23 and beyond. And that's where we're going to run out. And so in this policy, again, what, the recommendations from Mary and Sharon and I are not to say drop it from 1.5, is to say that, if the OPEB Trust Committee wants to look at a schedule that is not $1.5 million, that presents an opportunity for us to be looking at this new pension fund. Because if we feel like we're making progress in the OPEB side, we know where we are on the pension side, and we can't lose progress overall from a big picture of benefits for retirees, whether it's healthcare or pension. And that's sort of the genesis of this. It's not saying drop it from 1.5. It's saying if the OPEB Trust Committee is going to adopt a schedule below $1.5 million per year, the natural and best practice, best sort of solution from our perspective as staff is to reappropriate that to the pension fund.
Well, I would,
Michelle, I just, well, I don't want to cut off the OPEB Trust Committee from having an input here. These are the financial policies that we're setting that are joint ones with the select board. And so, I think that it's our role to say what we think, and we're comfortable with having it be. And then, we can have that discussion with the OPEB Trust Committee. But
can I just say, my main issue is the majority of retirees are school employees. Okay, OPEB is all town employees. The pension isn't the majority of the employees, and that's where I have an issue. And maybe it's just my issue, but
no, I agree.
That's the issue that I have.
I'd like to see it be additive, as I said, putting money aside from free cash.
yeah, well, to your point, Dan, one thing that I would like to see explicitly stated somewhere in this document, given this discussion and given, I think, the way we think about this, is we should make a very clear statement that the money from OPEB if the OPEB, if there is a change, that none of this money goes into the operating budget until all of our outstanding liabilities are fully funded. So that would, in other words, I don't want to get to the point where the OPEB trust board says, okay, to meet 2033, we only need to put aside, based on the latest report, we only need to put aside 1.1 million. So we're sitting here having a discussion that says, okay, if we do that, we're going to take the 400,000, we're going to put it into pension stabilization, which I think we all agree on. But the minute that happens, there's going to be a bunch of hands reaching into the till saying, I want part of that 400,000. So I think that from a policy perspective, the goal, that to your point, that 1.5 million was never in the operating budget, right? It was savings recognized through a separate measure. So to me, the policy document, given that we're now having this discussion about shifting the funds around, we should make a clear statement in there that the policy is that 1.5 million total doesn't go anywhere near the operating budget until all of our outstanding liabilities are fully funded. So when or if the OPEB trust committee says you need to put less in OPEB, that it goes into pension stabilization. And if the state comes along 3 years from now and says, hey, guess what? We're passing the buck to you on the teachers' retirement system, so you have to put then we put it into there. But you do not, a penny of it doesn't go into the operating budget, for operating expenses until all of our outstanding liabilities are paid.
And just to reiterate that, I mean, that is, and again, I understand we did not make this recommendation to you thinking that there was not going to be any feedback. But at the same point, to the point that the chair just made, that is sort of a mechanism that is in this recommendation for a policy change, right? It is saying, we're not saying cut back entirely. We're saying that this is a different approach that is sort of ticking off two different things, right? I understand that you may not agree with it. And I would, if there's a way that, what you just worded, you'd like to send, and we could try to work out, the wording of it and go through another iteration that we think could all work. I mean, I agree with what you just said, I guess is my point.
Yeah, well, that's why I said, and just to be clear, I'm not insinuating that you were implying anything else. I'm just saying that given this discussion we're having, if anybody's listening to it and hearing the words OPEB might go down, you're going to have all these, the requests for funding. So I'm saying we should make it clear right from the get-go that if there is a recommendation to change that 1.5 million, that it doesn't go anywhere near anybody's operating budget until all of our outstanding liabilities, which is what you're suggesting, by the way. So that's why I said it's not inconsistent with what you're suggesting, but we should just explicitly state that in the policy. So Vin.
I was just going to reiterate and concur with you completely that, we got to get both liabilities down. And if, God forbid, we have to deal with the teacher's retirement because the state says, no, it's not our responsibility, then that's another liability we have to worry about. So, yep.
Yeah. Okay. So you've gotten our feedback, Travis. I can provide you a little more, comment. I can just kind of summarize some of this offline and get it back to you. But do you want to take it back to the professionals and render any changes or recommendations based on our feedback? We'll be happy to do that.
Absolutely. And then just to sort of circle back to the one point on cannabis revenue, I did cover this with the select board last night, and Vin and Michelle were there. I mean, the end result is, do we need to feel compelled to get something on the October warrant? No, because of the fact that potentially adopting a local option, if the town is sort of saying this is what we'd like we would like those revenues to go, may not be in effect until FY23 anyway. So May is not necessarily lost ground. I would anticipate as I start to talk warrant next week with the select board, which would be Thursday instead of Monday, that we'll probably have something cannabis related on the October warrant, most likely related to how town meeting would like to deal with this new change about delivery, which is a CCC change that we need to be prepared for from a town perspective. So it would not be out of place to have the conversation in October on how we'd like to handle cannabis revenue moving forward. To Dan's question earlier on, can I project cannabis revenue? No, I can throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. But honestly, once these HCAs that have specific dollar amounts are gone. It's going to take us a couple years until we can come to a true analysis of where our revenue is going, because the HCAs say once the companies become operational, it then takes 14 to 18 months before they have to give us the 3% of wholesale sales. So then there's going to be a reconciliation of that. Then we'll get into the actual sort of annual payments, and then we'll begin to see the trend analysis. And so we're a little ways away from that. And so it may be that the most prudent thing to do is just say 100% goes to general stabilization, or 100% goes to a new stabilization fund. So it's all segregated by itself. And just do that off the bat, because then there is no question on an annual basis. Because the opposite is, if we want to say 50%, let's say, goes to a stabilization fund, 50% goes to, the tax goes to local receipts. Now we need to justify and come up with an assumption for what is going into. Now that's great because it can support our operating, but again, we're not there yet because I don't know what that revenue is going to look like.
So the reason for
You're saying the pot money's going up in smoke? Is that what you're telling me?
It's going up.
The reason I ask is that, I think that this funding mechanism sort of lends itself to potentially being used for something that maybe we wouldn't ordinarily try to do or be able to do with the operating money. And rather than just sort of see it go into the operating fund and just get kind of broken up into a whole bunch of things, and this could be what the stabilization fund is for, maybe, I guess, but is whether, we dedicate some of the money to mental health resources, to, things that, really sort of are value additive to the community. And that clearly there's a great need for from the community. And so having an idea of what the revenue might be, and if those 5-year plans maybe there's enough to sort of bridge the gap between those 14 and 18 months that they have. I just don't know that to sort of say, hey, we're going to, the last thing you want to do is hire somebody and not necessarily know you're going to be able to have that revenue come in, or know you're going to have the revenue come in, but there may be a year where you actually can't pay them because you're waiting for it to ramp. So that, look, that's not really the role of the finance committee to kind of come up with these spending plans. That's more, sort of operating policy, if you will, rather than financial policy. But from a personal note, that would be something that I would be interested in seeing some of this money go to. So that was sort of part. And then also, if we are going to actually build it into the local receipt revenue assumptions, then we also should have an idea, if we're going to start building it into the spending plan, what those numbers are actually.
Yeah. Well, obviously that presumably when Travis goes over local receipt estimates with us, he'll factor whatever we do there in there. But the one thing I was going to, just as an FYI for you, Travis, and I'm sure this is probably on your radar, but the other thing I'm starting to get a little concerned about is the trend line with COVID here. If things don't improve, we could be looking at an October town meeting without the ability to change it, by the way, because there's no longer a state of emergency. That might be at a bad time. So if it's not on your radar already, you might also be thinking in the back of your mind of what a minimal October might look like if the pandemic forces that. Would we want to go in with a 40 article October town meeting if we're going to have back to the masking and everything else, which we were in May, but I'm just saying that with a much more dangerous strain circulating. So I just was thinking about that the other day, because I'm like, as we ramp up, it's like we should have had a town meeting in July this year, right? Then we could have had it, no masks, anything. And, now, right, it kind of hits the humps every town meeting. So
I would have wanted that, but,
Go ahead, Ben.
Yep. Before we wrap up, I'm wondering, do we have a meeting for the CapEx committee? Just so we're for next week. We tentatively scheduled one, but it was all based off of, since everybody's here, 3 of the members and Travis, not to disturb the other 3 members who are here on the line.
I had it on Tuesday on my calendar.
Okay, so are we our meeting? Then
it's the capital subcommittee, I guess.
Before our meeting, right? Before
Yes.
finance committee meeting.
Yes.
Yep, that's good.
Okay, just want to
And
confirm, and I'll send out the information to.
Yes,
I'll get
Mr. Subcommittee Chair.
I'll get the updates that I got from the facilities manager into the document and redline it and get it out.
Okay.
The other thing, Ken, I'd like to add to our meeting next week is I'd like to talk to the schools about the tuition fee full day.
Okay, let's be clear. He was talking about a capital subcommittee meeting.
Yeah, no.
Not a full meeting of the committee.
Right.
So do you want them to come to the capital subcommittee meeting?
No, I just thought we were asking for things now.
What?
I just thought we were asking for things now.
Okay. No, we still have stuff on the agenda to deal with.
Oh, okay. Well, you made it seem like we were done. So
we're done with the policy discussion, right? That was only one of.
I blame Vin.
Yep. Blame me.
And then
Sorry.
Okay.
liaison updates.
That's right. So
My bad.
Travis, any TA updates?
Yes. So we had your two liaisons. I assume they'll cover the Stantec sidewalk report was delivered. I would say it was not complete, but probably 90% complete to the select board last night. It really is, looking at the 50 miles of sidewalks that we have. And I think the consensus was they owe us a little bit on any areas they feel like we could have for connectivity, but they're also working or have worked with the Green International Group, which is doing the complete streets and that prioritization list, which is almost complete. And then they'll work internally as well with the team in Stantec who's doing the waters and try to come up with some synergy there and have that part of those reports. The ARPA steering group met last Monday and is meeting tomorrow to continue to get through the 17 requests that came in by the soft deadline of August 2nd. So they'll meet tomorrow and cover 3 more requests: Youth and Family Services, Library, and Council on Aging. Then the next week, Rail Trail, and one that was external group that I wasn't familiar with. And then that will be the 17 requests. All Day K, I believe is what Dan was mentioning earlier, was the big one that was talked about and approved last night. And that's going to be, a major message out from the school committee coming soon because it'll impact the upcoming school year. The warrant is open, as you know, but we didn't meet last week. So the warrant is open through September 20th. Working with the capital subcommittee, as Vin just mentioned, on capital separately. So when that's ready for the whole group, we can bring that when Vin is ready. Vin already talked about next Tuesday is the capital meeting before your meeting. The TAC gave an update, which is online, to the select board, which was, I believe, a question that had come up at a previous FinCom meeting. They're planning to do so. I can't remember if it was Ben Sparrow or somebody from FinCom who would ask for it. TAC presented a report, which was accepted and put online. If anybody's interested in that or has questions, let me know. And then last night, just as we move through all these previous warrant articles, a contract was awarded to Weston and Sampson for the feasibility study for a DPW project that has an allowance of 5 months, and it is under budget based on the first contract. There's always change orders potentially.
Can you find bedrock or whatever it is? Find ledge when you're doing a study? No, I'm just kidding.
No, I don't know if they'll look for ledge, but they will be looking at the locations that we have. They'll be looking at all the options. And so 5 months, puts it on a turnaround time that may have us looking in May, depending on, again, if they're able to come up with what they think is an obvious solution. And if there isn't, I think we're going to have a lot to discuss after that feasibility study, but moving ahead on that one.
Okay. Yeah. Any questions for Travis?
I do. I have a comment.
Oh, sorry about that, Ben.
That's all right. The Stantec study regarding the sidewalks, there were 2 things I pointed out. Are they going to go back and rejigger their ratings and everything to get rid of the 2 schools that are sitting nowhere that there's actually schools? I try to figure out where one of the schools there is, and I think it's the Bullard Memorial Farm. The only thing I could think of that's rated as being educational, maybe. But then there's one over in by the Milford line. If you saw the map they had last night, everybody, it was like 2 places of schools they had. And I said, there's no schools there. One being the Sherburne near the Bullard Farm, and the other one, like I said, is over by Milford side of the rail trail. And how they have schools there, they said it's zoned that way. Like, oh, okay. I'm not sure why. And the other thing was,
meaning zone like zoning zones, or zone like there's a school zone.
There's something they're pulling in from their systems, and correct me if I'm wrong, Travis. They said it was from our zoning.
Zoning, yep.
Yep. And also the parks, the two parks, they didn't list as parks because of zoning. The ones across my street, that's what I'm listing as, the Potomac and Started. And I'm wondering if that would change their rating systems at all.
We can inquire.
If you look at page 24 of the Stantec survey, the Stantec study, if you look at page 24.
The Travis, by the way, just a side note, you mentioned TAC. I'll just point out that it's now officially 2 months since I submitted my formal thing to TAC and have not heard back at all. And I will note that the suggestion I made, they are already doing at the rail trail. So makes even less sense that they did what they did at the corner, what was done at the corner of Central and Washington. So
hey Ken, it's a little bit tacky to bring up your own personal issues
Very tacky.
well,
very
I thought
tacky.
when Travis brought it up, I thought it was a good sign.
Tacky.
He's trying to play with
I know, I
tack,
get it.
but his dad jokes are really bad.
Really bad.
Okay, so anything else, Travis?
The other thing was mentioned last night, and I'll just add, because I'm the liaison who sat through the meeting, the engineer. Tina and everybody was talking about having a professional engineer. John Cronin suggested maybe we can have some sort of sharing. So I know it's something Michelle has talked about, and we bandied about it at DPW liaison discussion. So a professional engineer on staff for the DPW. So,
Well, the one thing I was thinking about with that, just two comments I want to make about that. One is, it doesn't necessarily have to be either or, right? Could you do something like literally like you have in the sense like we do with town council, where you have a town, you have an engineer that's kind of retained to do this work, by the town, where you pay them a retainer and then they bill per hour or something when you have work. That's one possibility. The other thing, and this is just for Travis in general, taking this one step higher, I really want to, now that we have a town administrator that has the financial background and, so forth, start moving towards a fully burdened cost model when we talk about employees. Because all the time we hear this discussion, oh, well, we'll pay the person this much and it'll pay for itself. Yeah, but that's not counting pension, OPEB, benefit costs and things like that. And so there's this idea that if somebody has an $80,000 salary, that if you save $80,000, that covers their cost. But they're, if they're on staff for 5 years or whatever, they're now incurring a much higher liability for pension and everything else. So we need to start moving towards a model of including fully burdened costs.
The pension is the trickiest part. I'll say that, right? I can tell you the cost of the highest cost family plan. We can tack that onto the overhead of everybody. Once you get into the pension, though, it really is like if you get somebody who comes in as a 9+2, actuarially speaking, they're not supposed to be creating a liability. If you get somebody who came in because they're bringing in past experience in municipal government and they're a 6+2, then they're creating a liability, and you can't not hire somebody because they're not a 9+2, right? So it's just a little tricky on the pension side. Everything else is doable though. And
no, but you can cost it though. Again, I'm not saying you have to sit there and say it's down to the 14th fraction of a cent, right? But the fact, all I'm saying is that there's a significant cost for benefit and pension, no matter how you model, right? You might get lucky and hire somebody that doesn't cost you a dime. But just like Mary does with benefits, where she says, okay, I assume that everybody that comes in is on a family plan, right? So now we know that not everybody takes family plan. Some people don't even take health insurance from the town because they have it through their spouse or whatever. But from a modeling perspective, I just think we should move beyond this idea that you just look at the salary and then that's the measure by which something is beneficial, right? Because my point about the town engineer, I'm not opposed to it. I've said before, if it saves it, if it's a net win relative to all this money we spend on studies and all the time we hire outside engineering, then yes, I'd be all for it. But it's not as simple as saying you pay for their salary, right? You got to factor in this, and that's what I'm saying. We should come up with a model that says, okay, we have a standard rate we apply of 35% to the salary that covers benefits, OPEB, whatever. So when making financial analyses of whether it's better to hire or not, we hold the bar to the higher true cost than that, or what our estimate of the true cost is, rather than just what we advertise the position for. So, okay, Vin, do you have anything else? Okay, so any other liaison updates? I think Michelle, you had one, right? Do you want to?
Well, I just want to throw out the number that's in the report. I don't know if everyone read the Stantec report, but $630,000 just to maintain existing sidewalks so that they, I don't understand that number because I guess that's to keep the sidewalks from getting worse, but
I understand it as similar to the roads. You need to repave roads, and so it's the same thing. You have to maintain the sidewalks, and they came up with a figure of $637,000 or $35,000 to basically maintain. So you're replacing something, something's going to get down and go lower on your list of depreciation. Things are going to get more depreciated. So as you replace them, they'll get higher up in the scale. So,
but isn't that dollar amount similar to our Chapter 90 total?
right. But the thing is, you're taking
more, I think.
taking sidewalks that like now aren't ADA compliant, and when you replace them, you're replacing them with ADA compliant sidewalks. So it's not like you're maintaining them; you're actually improving existing sidewalks.
So actually, I have a question about that for Travis. I don't know if you know this, but something you can follow up on for sure. One thing that's always confused me about ADA compliance for sidewalks is the fact that contrary to some people's belief, the earth isn't flat. So I've always wondered what it means to be compliant. I know that in general, when you talk about things like handicap ramps to entrances to buildings, there are grade requirements, that you have to be able to wheel at a certain percent grade, things like this. But when you're talking sidewalks, you're talking about streets that are going up hills, down hills, right?
they talked about that last night.
Okay. Well, then you can answer my question.
And
right?
the roads, it doesn't matter what happens. If the roads are going, then so be it. The person has to deal with it. The deal with the thing is the ramp and the sidewalk needs to be at least 4 feet in width.
Yeah,
And
they
so
didn't have an issue with the width for the most part, was what they said. But I mean, Bill's point on what Vin just said, which is the ramp itself, is that you really need to be, I mean, we're contracting out most of this work, right? Our DPW is not creating entrances for the most part. They're doing some curb cuts, but they're not creating a lot of these. We're contracting out the work, is to say, look, you really need to be monitoring the work that's being done by it, because I think Bill's quote was, the width of a credit card can throw you out of ADA compliance on one of these access points, right? Now, the other thing that he said, and I don't know if Vin or Michelle caught it and had a better recollection than I do on it, was, you're going to be pretty much out of compliance on anywhere where you're connecting to the rail trail. And so I guess, I would look for a little clarity on what that means, because if we're feeling okay that the rail trail can't be ADA compliant, then can we cross all of those off? And does that drastically impact the overall number, which anyway, but that was the quote that he had.
That makes no sense to me, to be honest with you.
Because it's gravel?
Well, that's different. If you say that the trail itself is not compliant because of the material it's made out of, right? But the way Travis said it was implying that the access would not be ADA compliant. I'm like, there are plenty of places, yes, not everywhere, but first of all, from a grade perspective, it definitely is ADA compliant because it's a train bed, right? So it has grading already it's the flattest place around town. But entrance-wise, there are places like, Casey's where it's street level, right? I don't see how you couldn't build an access to the trail right there that's ADA compliant. So again, I don't want to, we don't need to be bogged down in that detail, but I'm just saying that statement doesn't make any sense to me at all. You'd say that unless you're saying that the rail itself is made out of material that's not compliant, and that's a different statement though.
Right. One of my concerns was when I heard ADA compliant, I was worried about width, that when you were replacing sidewalks, they had to get wider and you'd have to take people's lawns. And so I thought, the attorney brain was thinking about taking and having, compensating people. And
they did know
that costs a lot more money.
They did know you can't have a telephone pole sticking inside of a sidewalk. That makes it uncompliant, because there's several I've driven.
There was a picture of it in the report of a tree coming in the middle of the road.
Too.
Yeah, well, that makes sense, right? Obviously, but that's why I said my thing was in the same breath you have a discussion about Winter Street. I'm like, how can you have a discussion about Winter Street and ADA compliance when that's like a 10% grade at some spots, So it's good. That's why I always wondered. So I guess as long as the ADA says it's the lay of the land, and it's just the cuts, then that's a totally different thing. So,
Right, but anyway, the width isn't an issue. He said that the sidewalks were wide enough, so.
good. Okay, so any other feedback from other meetings, liaison updates, anything like that? Nothing on the school side, by the way. Obviously, it's their relatively slow season, so don't have anything to report on the schools. But one would presume that as we get closer to the start of school, we'll start, hearing more from them.
Liaison updates, is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, so Vin and I met with the parks and the DPW, was it just yesterday? They're looking to sort of do a whole reorg of the way that we maintain the fields, essentially staffing up some of the DPW to really maintain a higher level of maintenance at the fields. There's no real sort of budget for what they're going to want right now, but it did seem like it would be a few additional FTEs and could be, depending on what parks can come up with from their revolving fund, which I think they can sustain to help pay for it, probably in the 100 to 200 sort of range. Depending on how it's done, how it's implemented, how quickly they ramp it up.
And factoring in all the benefits costs, as we just discussed.
No benefits costs. In fact,
no, I know. I'm telling Travis that.
They weren't throwing. I was kind of forcing them to sort of put some sort of FTE on it. I mean, that's almost more my number based upon what they were sort of saying they thought they would need. So this is not in any way official, but right. Just reading the tea leaves. It's not $25,000, right? It's a larger ask than that. Okay, and then there's going to be capital equipment on top of it, but that would be for next year.
Right. So the one thing I would say, my comment about that would be, what are we doing now? I know that Parks is in charge of it, but I'm saying that if we're talking about things like maintaining the fields, is it that they aren't maintaining stuff at all, and so we need staffing to do it? Are they contracting that out? Are they using Bob, and Bob's the only one doing it? In other words, where I'm agreeing with the plan, right? We've talked for years about DPW kind of managing these things and not having Parks do it, but to need 3 FTEs, part of me is saying, okay,
it's doing more than what we're doing now.
My understanding is the baseball team fields are horrible, and they've gotten feedback as such. Okay. So that was 2 years ago when I was on the Park and Rec liaison and meeting with them and hearing from them. So I doubt it's changed. It's probably gotten different, but they've contracted out to try to get the grades fields up to a little bit better to open them, but then the maintaining them is totally up to Bob. And Bob split 3 ways between Parks and Rec, school, and DPW. So, yeah.
And then when he gets called off to do something else, he's not able to do the maintenance. And so
that's fine. I just wanted to make sure. At first I was reading this as it's maintaining, it's like just a shift in responsibility for the same services. And I was like, why would you shift responsibility if you have to hire 3 people to do that?
No, they've gotten a lot of feedback.
If it's improving service, then that's a total different.
They've gotten a lot of feedback that things are not where people would like them to be. And you yourself have been one of those talking about Pleasure Point.
Yep, I've played on those fields, and I know that they're not.
Well, and Pleasure Point and everything. So I think this is a holistic look at really, upgrading our maintenance and delivering to the town what the town would like to see in the quality and the maintenance of the fields.
Mm-hmm. But and I'll point out as a side note that if we do end up hiring a couple of people for DPW, that changes our OPEB liability and needs to be factored into whether we cut the 1.5 million. But that's just on this, because I'm saying that in joking, but at the same time, I will point out that in our last valuation, that was the driver of the increased liability, was that staffing had increased.
Well, no, right? It was also the mortality
tables were updated too. But I'm just saying, if you look at the employees, if you look at the last 2 valuations, there was a big jump in the number of staff, and that was primarily hiring at the schools. But I'm just saying that there was, that does factor in, right? The more you put on the payroll, the more you have to plan for those benefits in retirement.
There are a lot of big sort of projects and desires throughout town. So I think that the budget for 2023 will be a very interesting one. I think there's going to be, you've got the Parks and Rec, you've got the engineering, you've got police officers, you've got, whatever that is going to happen to the schools. There's a lot of, and I think that, the town has sort of worked to get by for years and sort of keep things as small as possible. But I think that the rubber is hitting the road.
Okay, well, hold it. And just to be clear, though, I think that's an unfair statement. That implies that we've been kind of scraping the bottom, and we haven't. We've expanded. We've had lots of hires in different areas. There may be a desire to do more because maybe we feel that we're not doing enough. That's different than saying we've been scraping, getting by, right? We've expanded. We've made a lot. I didn't mean to say we haven't been doing anything. Right? I didn't mean we haven't been doing anything, but it is certainly, it's certainly from the finance committee's perspective, there hasn't been the request for all this stuff for years. So it's not like we've been shooting things down, but just that I think that people are realizing they want more out of the town and the town's properties and. Yeah, and that's a decision for the townspeople to make, right? When we have budget. Go ahead, Travis.
I was going to say to the point with Dan and Vin, I think the way we left the conversation was, certainly it's going to require most likely some type of service agreement with the parks. They understand, and they've sort of expressed this in their open meetings as well, is that they'd like to move from a custodian of these fields to a client, a customer, and that is going to require them to, put up part of this as well. And so whereas, a 26 police officer or a town engineer, if the town goes down either of those paths and has that conversation, really is coming from the tax levy, there is potential offsets here to the tax levy from the parks revolving fund. And so, I think there's some homework to be done. I think it was a good conversation, though, to Dan's point, that, I think everybody agrees on the need and the homework is going to be sort of done and brought back.
Okay. Okay. So anything else? Any other liaison updates of note? Okay, then we have reached the end of our agenda. So if anybody has anything else.
Yeah, so if I could, just based upon the ARPA, the tuition-free full-day kindergarten, I would like to talk with the schools about it. I just to say I'm fully supportive of tuition-free full-day kindergarten. I've been trying, obviously the town has been interested in doing this for a number of years. However, after watching the presentation last night, recorded, but watching the presentation last night, I do have some concerns about how we're going to how we're going about funding it and paying for it and the way we're doing it. And just want to have that conversation with them now before it's done, but before, actually go down there.
Right. There's no question that there's planning on their part that needs to be done so that they are prepared to take the full share when the time comes, right? They're being subsidized early on. They have to, and that was a point that was made repeatedly. So, if you want to talk to them about it, fine, I'll reach out to them and see.
I think it's important. And Travis and Ken, for both, because you're both in those meetings, this is going to be obviously probably the most drastic example of it. But for decisions that the ARPA steering group is making and that then the select board is voting on that have future operating budget implications, whereas essentially you're voting to pay for something for 3 years or some period of time that you then expect that the town is going to have to pick up. I would greatly appreciate that there be at least communication, if not a sort of a discussion with the finance committee before the final sort of vote is done. Not to say that we're going to have any ability to change, to make the decision, right? That obviously lays with the ARPA steering group and then the select board. But voice our opinions and if we have any concerns or anything like that, just for those who don't know, I mean, this tuition-free full-day kindergarten is going to have to be paid for at the end of the 4 or 5 year period.
Third year, yeah. They say it's the fifth year because of reserves, but whatever it's a $650,000 cost, and maybe by the end of it, it's more than that. So we're gonna have to figure out a way to pay for that, and we all know that things are tight as it is. So. Right, and just to make you feel better, Dan, I will point out one thing, that this is never a big issue in Holliston because we have a competent town administrator and so forth. But even though ARPA allows the decisions to be made by the select board, we still have on our books a bylaw that says that the finance committee must be consulted for a recommendation on any municipal spending question. So theoretically, even though we have no power to alter the decision, the idea of saying they should, they should consult us on some of this is within our bylaws supposed to happen.
I'm just formally asking for that. And while I am fully confident in your capability to represent certainly your views and certainly what you think the views may be of the Finance Committee, I think that it's not fair to shoulder that burden fully on you. And
no, that's fine. That's why I said I have no problem.
I think it means more.
Travis is listening.
Right. I think it means more if the entire committee also gets a chance to weigh in, especially on these larger decisions. If it's $2,000, I mean, I'd like to know about it, but it's not, certainly going to break the bank. $650,000 is another matter.
Yeah. Well, Travis, just so you know, that is a discussion that I mentioned to Travis a while ago in the ARPA meetings, and he is already kind of flagging things that will have operating implications. So he's aware of that as well, not just because I told him, but because he understands that any money we put towards those types of things, he's going to have to be tracking his recommendations as well.
We should be tracking it so that in year 3, 4, and 5 or whatever, we're not, we don't put in, $1.5 million in need to. And look, Travis is obviously very competent, doing a great job. So I'm sure he knows that and would never put us in that position. But it would be abrogating our responsibility as the financial oversight board for the town if we didn't at least request it.
Yep.
I meant that in all sincerity, but
yep.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Anybody have anything else before we wrap for tonight? Okay. I will talk to the schools about next week. Travis, if you have agenda items for next week, like right now, I don't know what we have for next week other than Dan's request for the schools to come in. We said we'd meet if we had to, but I don't know. We have the capital subcommittee meeting, but I don't know if we will necessarily even have, if I can't get the schools in next week, we may not have a reason for a FinCom meeting next week. So keep me posted.
So I would also just say, one of the things that might be interesting if you are going to have the schools, and Vin, made a point to Lisa Koshin, who was representing the school committee's budget subcommittee on the capital subcommittee of the Finance Committee call from last
enough words there
2 weeks ago. That we do need to kind of have a time frame where they're comfortable. We have some placeholders on the assumption for October for the schools, but they do need to define what they're definitely going to ask for. May or may not be Chromebooks, may or may not be rooftop units.
May or may not be Chromebooks. Where have you been?
And so, I think my understanding was Lisa was comfortable with the timeline we laid out. But if they're moving faster than that, then that might impact your meeting with them as well. So I think we can follow up, either Vin or I, see where they are with that.
If we're going to have the schools, could we have executive sessions so they could at least tell us what's happening with the contracts?
I can certainly request that if they want to entertain that. Yes. So anything else?
It's our request that we get an update. So. Yep.
Anybody have anything else before we wrap? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay. There's no debate on that motion, so proceed right to a vote. Mr. Whitaker.
Yes.
Mr. Murphy.
Yes.
Mr. Alfred.
Yes.
Ms. Zemer.
Yes.
And I vote no. Just kidding. No, I vote yes. That concludes the Tuesday, August 17th meeting of the Finance Committee. Thank you for joining us tonight. As you heard, we'll likely, if I can get the schools in, we'll likely be meeting next Tuesday, the 24th. But for tonight, we're done. So thank you and good night.